Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Atrophy of Soul and welcome finally to my top 10 games of 2017. As many of you are aware of, I play video games specifically for their gameplay. If a title has beautiful graphics and an interesting story, then that is little more than window dressing as far as I'm concerned. When I think about what it is that makes a video game great, I invariably go back to the gameplay because gameplay is the driving element behind this medium, and it is what distinguishes gaming from more passive forms of entertainment such as film or literature. Does this mean that I can't enjoy experiences with mediocre gameplay and well-written stories? Well, of course not, but the reason that this medium exists and has become such a mainstay in popular culture is specifically because of its unadulterated, layered, and addictive game mechanics. Game mechanics are what stand the test of time. They are the reason that you find yourself going back to 10, 20, or even 30-year-old games that have long since become relics of a much simpler, yet more interesting era. You don't go back to your game collections and pop in Mega Man X, Mario 64, Left 4 Dead, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, or even Overwatch because of their deeply engrossing stories, themes, and lore. No, you go back to them because they are fun, well-designed challenges that are satisfying to overcome. Now, there are definitely times to go back and replay titles in order to relive the stories that they have to tell, but I'd like you to think about the games that you replay on a consistent basis for a moment. What do they entail? If your favorite game is your favorite game of all time because of its story, is it really your favorite game of all time, or is it simply a game which includes your favorite story of all time? Then there are the feelings that are elicited within you during moment-to-moment gameplay that should be considered when weighing the pros and cons of any particular title. Think about the experience in its totality. Within each moment, are you engrossed? Are you frustrated? Are you bored? Do you just want to get to the next cutscene? Are you enthralled by the systems that the developers have created? Or are you simply pushing on in order to see how the game ends? Think about these questions next time you're wondering about what it is that makes your favorite games, because in many cases, it seems as though gamers by and large are easily swayed by the spectacle and novelty of an experience as opposed to the substance and nuances that it may or may not be composed of. It's easy to be impressed by shiny new graphics, well-written stories, and enthralling music, but when the core facet of the experience suffers at the expense of these novelties, is it really worth it? Clearly, I would say no, but hey, that's just me. Titles that fall into this category are amazing tech demos, but that's all they are, a demonstration of how well current technology can render a given scene. There's nothing beyond their aesthetic qualities to hook you, and in 2 to 3 years, those once impressive and captivating graphics will be laughable in comparison to what can be produced effortlessly by more modern titles. So once all of the pretty shiny new graphics are scrubbed away, what are you left with? A shallow, substance-less experience that can barely compete with games that were made even 10 years prior to its inception? These aren't things that make video games great, and I think that this is something that we tend to understand on a visceral level as opposed to a conscious one, because we often look back on these games with rose-tinted glasses because of how impressive they were for their time, only to come back to them years later to find that they are full of game design flaws that we overlooked simply because of how well the game designers captivated us with an increase in pixel count. So how exactly do I form my opinions on video games? What is the barometer that I use? Well, there are a number of questions that must be taken into account, which include: are the video games well designed? Are the core mechanics layered? Do they do a good job of exploring their mechanics? Do they allow their gameplay to suffer at the expense of their stories? Do they do a good job of integrating story with gameplay? Etc, etc. It's a balance that's difficult to achieve, but through this list I hope to present some titles that do an exceptional job of creating systems for players to truly lose themselves in. Games are a beautiful reflection of life because what makes them truly interesting are the challenges that they put forth and by what means the developers have allowed you to overcome said challenges. There's this pervasive idea in the gaming media that's parroted assiduously, the idea that challenge is exclusionary, it's non-inclusive, it's detrimental to the egos of those who are less skilled. Well, I've got to say that for once the gaming media is exactly right. Challenges are exclusionary, they are non-inclusive, and they will destroy any sense of ego that you have if you aren't willing to put the time in. However, unlike the pseudo-intellectuals that you find in the gaming media, I believe that this is a good thing. Clearly, people have different tastes, therefore not every experience is going to be for everyone, nor should they be. If you aren't willing to get good enough at Ninja Gaiden or, God forbid, Cuphead to complete them, then perhaps you should play something else. It's a simple solution. If you don't want to learn, if you don't want to better yourself, if you don't want to grow, then you made a poor choice when choosing this hobby, because that's what gaming is all about. Go engross yourself in a visual novel like Life is Strange or Gone Home if you want to be held by the hand and treated like a self-righteous baby who huffs their own farts. The bottom line is that there is a barrier to entry in everything that you attempt to do. In order to read a great book, you need to be able to understand the written word. In order to sing a great song, you need to understand how to carry a tune. In order to run, you need to understand how to walk. And in order to play a great video game, you need to be willing to understand how to properly execute its mechanics. The experiences that are truly worthwhile tend to be the most difficult, because at the end of the trials and tribulations that you had to suffer through is a potent sense of self-satisfaction in knowing that you've done something truly awesome. Gaming allows anyone to do and be anything as long as they are willing to learn, so either learn to play or start reviewing coloring books gaming media. That seems to be more your speed, but try not to color too much outside the lines. I know that it can be difficult due to your obvious lack of hand-eye coordination. I'm sure that you'll catch up with 2-year-old Samantha one of these days. Now that I've sufficiently maligned the gaming media and have explained how I form my opinions on video games, let's talk a little bit about 2017 in the industry before we get to the top 10 proper. 2017 has been one of the best years for video games in a very long time. This is the first year since I started making these lists back in 2013, actually back in 2010, but no one knows about that I've had a truly difficult time figuring out which games I should include. There were around 20 games that I took under consideration, and quite a number of them found themselves on and off of this list multiple times before I settled on the titles that you will be seeing in this video. I think that what made 2017 truly amazing for me was that it was a year that focused on reviving dormant design philosophies that were forgotten or completely discarded in prior console generations. Taking inspiration from the generations past and reinterpreting them in order to create fresh experiences has been the name of the game this year. The vast majority of the greatest games of the year were praised specifically for going back to their roots. This is something that I've been communicating on my channel for years now if you've been paying attention, so it's been quite an experience seeing the idea be put into practice, for better or worse. The idea of an quote-unquote archaic design choice isn't something that I believe is possible in the realm of video games. Unlike other mediums, I think that video games can actually benefit from reviving dead design philosophies, because any gameplay system can work in the modern era if it is properly contextualized for players. Even something as controversial as tank controls could be well implemented in a modern title if the developers were savvy enough to introduce it to players in an organic way. There was plenty this year to love, and while I enjoyed myself thoroughly, I will say that this return to form for many classic franchises has also made the lack of originality in the industry quite apparent. As confident as I am in my list, the vast majority of titles found on it will be of long-standing franchises that have been around for decades now. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it would have been nice to have seen a few more surprises over the course of the year, but honestly, this is a very minor nitpick considering the insanely high bar that many of these titles set throughout the course of the year. I don't think that there has been a year this jam-packed with amazing games since the early 2000s, and honestly, 2018 is already shaping up to be another keystone year, with early Game of the Year contenders such as Dragon Ball FighterZ and Monster Hunter World already on the market, but I digress. So briefly, before we jump into the games, I'd like to outline the limitations I impose upon myself when constructing this list. Firstly, HD remasters are excluded because they aren't brand new games, they're simply reskins. So as amazing as some of these remasters were, I'm looking at you, Crash Bandicoot, unless they're full-on overhauls of the original experience a la Resident Evil Remake, then there's no reason for me to talk about them here. I want to focus on brand new games, but with that said, I will be including a list of honorable mentions in the credits of this video, which will include remasters, games that I unfortunately didn't get to finish, as well as handheld games and games that I'm anticipating in 2018. Lastly, these are my personal top 10 games of 2017. This isn't an objective list by any means, however, I can say without question that every single game here has a core set of mechanics that are very well thought out, polished, and fun to experiment with. Now, whether or not their core gameplay is perfectly utilized is another question entirely, but all of the titles here are excellent games and should be experienced at least once by anyone who loves gameplay. They aren't perfect and some of them are deeply flawed, but they are worthy of your time nonetheless. Now, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let us finally get to the games. Here are my choices. Of all of the games on this list, Hollow Knight is perhaps the one that most completely integrates my particular views of what constitutes an excellent video game into its design philosophy. Hollow Knight takes advantage of everything that makes this medium so unique and enthralling, and while it is by no means a perfect game, the journey that is provided here is one that is so memorable and well constructed that it's difficult not to be genuinely touched by the experience once the credits finally roll. Hollow Knight is a Metroidvania style game where players find themselves exploring labyrinthine environments that want them dead at every turn. Starting off with very little direction and a very limited moveset, exploring the expansive environment will be a daunting task at first. However, as you traverse further into the depths, defeating bosses, finding new locales, overcoming some excellent platforming challenges, and acquiring new abilities, Hollow Knight will grow with each threat that has been vanquished. There are a surprising number of attacks and abilities that Hollow Knight can acquire over the course of the experience, and the way that the game tailors its challenges to make the most out of each of these abilities helps in creating a system that has a level of mechanical complexity that puts most other Metroidvania-esque titles to shame. By the time you've reached the end of Hollow Knight, you will find yourself jump canceling, air dashing, double jumping, striking, and evading in ways that you would have never imagined possible during your first few hours of gameplay. Hollow Knight is consistently adding layers upon layers to its gameplay system with each boss defeated and area overcome. Just when you think that the game has shown you everything that it has to offer, it throws you for a loop with a brand new secret to discover or an entirely new area to explore. There's just so much to love about Hollow Knight, and while the overall experience here is excellent, there are a few shortcomings that keep it from being on the level of titles such as Super Metroid or Castlevania Symphony of the Night. One of the primary faults with Hollow Knight is how long it takes for players to gain access to some of the more interesting and mechanically nuanced abilities. What really drives the experience initially is its excellently constructed art design and atmospheric tension. However, in spite of how beautifully implemented these elements may be, it doesn't detract from the fact that Hollow Knight is very slowly paced, especially at the outset. You won't gain access to some of the more truly impressive abilities until around 75% of the way into the game. But with that being said, this doesn't mean that the entirety of that 75% is lackadaisically pieced together by the developers. On the contrary, that portion of the game is amazing in and of itself, but the game doesn't truly reach excellence until after you've reached a certain point. Lastly, Hollow Knight's level design can end up feeling somewhat repetitive due to the fact that hills and slopes are conspicuously absent from the game world. Every environment that you traverse in Hollow Knight is unique and beautiful, however, every area is made up of square blocks that will become grating to look at as you move further and further into the experience. Some areas will begin to blur together because of this fact, which keeps the level design from being something truly unique and memorable. Notwithstanding, Hollow Knight is an experience that should not be missed, especially for lovers of open game design that places emphasis on player freedom and mechanical complexity. Considering that Hollow Knight features some of the most fun and rewarding gameplay of the year, with challenging bosses, intricate level design, amazing music, and a lengthy campaign, it would be an absolute tragedy for anyone to overlook this title, especially when it only costs around $15. If you love lengthy, layered, and lavish Metroidvania-style games, Hollow Knight is a must-have that will reward you with an experience that will surprise you at each and every turn. King of Iron Fist Tournament makes its triumphant return to the gaming landscape with the unapologetic, stylish, and enthralling 7th entry in the series, which takes everything that you know and love about Tekken and polishes it to near perfection. Perhaps the greatest entry in the franchise since Tekken 5 Dark Resurrection, Tekken 7 does an excellent job demonstrating why the Tekken franchise is one of the most important titles in the fighting game genre. The core of Tekken's combat revolves around finding openings in your opponent's defenses in order to juggle them into oblivion. While this basic summation of the core tenets of Tekken may seem somewhat shallow, when put into practice it makes for some of the most intense and visceral combat that has ever been introduced into the genre. Previous entries of the series could be rightly criticized for going a little too far with the juggling system, particularly Tekken 6 and Tag 2. However, 7 seems to have found a healthy balance so as not to make every fight feel as though a single juggle will lead to your untimely demise. In addition to the revamped combat system, each character has been equipped with super moves and cinematic finishers that are not only impressive to look at, but can be a great way of keeping your opponents guessing. These brand new attacks add another layer of strategy to each combat encounter and work particularly well against overconfident opponents who have let their guard down in the heat of battle. Every character offers a unique set of options and abilities for players to experiment with and come equipped with lengthy move lists which may be difficult to wrap your head around initially. It's a little too easy to spend hours upon hours in the practice mode simply learning the ins and outs of your character of choice and creating impressive combos to show off to both your friends and adversaries alike. There's so much here to learn and experiment with in terms of the core system at play, and that's not even getting into the extra modes that keep the game feeling fresh and exciting, such as Treasure Battle, online multiplayer, and Tekken Bowl, which will reward you with in-game currency to purchase new accessories and costumes for each of the characters in the game simply by playing. Unlike some of its contemporaries, Tekken 7 is generous with its in-game currency, and just about everything is easily unlockable without forcing players to use microtransactions. Then there's the story mode, which includes what is perhaps the most well-implemented use of a guest character I've ever seen in a fighting game. As over-the-top and ridiculous as Tekken's story may be, there's no denying that the developers know how to make it into a riveting and exciting experience. The first time that Akuma shows up in the story mode is one of the most badass, memorable, and exciting moments in fighting game history. As soon as his theme begins playing and you take control of him, you can't help but feel excited by the prospect of what are perhaps the two biggest fighting games of all time clashing in a way that Street Fighter X Tekken failed to deliver on. Even though there are still some exploitable facets of the combat which can make certain battles feel unbalanced, that's just the nature of the fighting game genre and isn't really something that can be completely ameliorated by the developers. There is yet to exist a fighting game which achieves a perfect equanimity across all characters, and there likely never will be unless there's a game out there that simply clones characters and changes their skins in order to add variety to them. However, in spite of its blemishes, Tekken 7 masterfully stands amongst some of the greatest fighting games of all time and is without question the best fighting game of 2017. If you have even a passing interest in the genre, you owe it to yourself to play Tekken 7. It's the perfect distillation of what makes fighting games great and will likely be held in high regard by fans of the genre for many years to come. If you've been searching for a worthy successor to both the original BioShock and System Shock 2, then look no further than Prey. Perhaps the most underrated and overlooked game of the year due in large part to its namesake, Prey is one of the most creative, ambitious, atmospheric, and multifaceted games on the market and is without question a hidden gem. What truly allows Prey to stand on its own as a stellar experience outside of its excellently paced and thought-provoking introduction is the emphasis that the developers placed on player freedom. Every objective in the game can be tackled in a multitude of ways. Even something as seemingly straightforward as navigating the environments can be mini puzzles within themselves. The player character discovers a glue gun early on in the game, which comes with the ability to both freeze enemies in place and create platforms around the environment that can be used to scale the multilateral levels. Through this gameplay element alone, players are given far more choice than they're likely to realize initially, and from there on, Prey continues to add even more options into the mix, including but not limited to hovering, dashing, transforming, hacking, and even the ability to reanimate corpses to fight alongside you. Not simply content with giving players a wide breadth of actions and abilities, Prey also excellently forces players to question everything that they see, hear, and experience, both mechanically and thematically. There isn't a single place on Talos 1 that feels safe because the primary antagonist of Prey, an alien collective known as the Typhon, has the uncanny ability to transform itself into objects in the environment. This means that no matter where you go, the threat of the Typhon will always be in the back of your mind. There's this palpable feeling of dread that consistently oppresses you throughout the entirety of the game, because even when you think you're safe, a mimic may just be hiding in plain sight to surprise you. The Typhon range in design and behavior, and each and every one of them offers up a unique challenge for players to overcome. There is one Typhon variant in particular known as the Nightmare, which will actually stalk you throughout a level until you either kill it or find a way to escape from its unrelenting assault, which leads to some of the most heart-pounding and intense moments in the entire title. Not only are the enemies and player characters' set of abilities well designed and implemented, but the level design on display here rivals even some of the industry's greatest. Arcane Studios was able to masterfully craft a world that feels truly lived in and real. All of the station's various locales make sense, and there's some excellent environmental storytelling on display here, giving even the original BioShock a run for its money. While Prey is a truly excellent and ambitious title, it doesn't come without flaws that may be hard for some players to overlook. First of which being that this is a very difficult game if you aren't accustomed to old school PC titles such as Deus Ex or System Shock 2. If you just want to go into Prey guns blazing, you are likely to become frustrated by the number of deaths you will invariably sustain for playing so recklessly. Prey can also, dare I say, fall prey to a number of strange design quirks and glitches, including NPCs talking over one another, texture popping, enemies getting stuck in between environments, and some really strange audio issues. Prey's most damning flaw, however, are its load times, especially on console. When loading up a brand new area, it can take upwards of an entire minute for the game to load, and considering how often you'll be navigating between these places in the second half of the game, I wouldn't be surprised if some people were to just give up on the experience outright. Finally, there's the game's divisive and polarizing ending, which definitely remains true to the spirit of the overall game design's emphasis on distrust and manipulation, but the designers may have done so to the detriment of the narrative in its entirety, depending on who you ask. Notwithstanding, Prey is easily the most underrated game of 2017 and is deserving of far more recognition than it's received. Prey isn't afraid to take risks and does a truly admirable job of giving players absolute freedom over their playstyles. With a lengthy 18 to 30 hour campaign depending on which ending you choose and side quests you decide to take part in, Prey is a title that's worthy of your time and attention as long as you are willing to give it a chance. There's an ingenious elegance to the way that Prey succeeds at manipulating player expectations that should not be missed. It's difficult to believe that The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild was Nintendo's first true foray into the open world genre, because they were somehow able to integrate the formula from their most popular contemporaries and expand upon them with a level of polish that is almost unheard of from this style of game. The level of artistry involved with making the land of Hyrule into such an organic and beautiful place to explore is second to none. There's almost too much to do and see here, and considering how vast the world of Hyrule has become, it will take most players upwards of 150 hours to uncover everything that this world has to offer. Where Breath of the Wild excels most is in the amount of freedom that it gives to players. After a brief tutorial sequence, the game opens up completely, and while it does nudge you into completing certain tasks in a specified order, it doesn't hinder you from sequence breaking or going straight to Hyrule Castle to face the final boss whenever whenever you'd like. There's also an impressive sense of scale here that's difficult to overlook. Unlike most open world games which claim that you can go anywhere while hindering you in various ways, Breath of the Wild actually does allow you to go wherever you'd like. While certain areas can definitely be difficult to traverse due to powerful enemies and hazardous environments, Link does have the potential to go to every single place on the map. In addition to the day and night cycle and various weather effects which can dramatically change the way certain tasks can be tackled, the overall design of the open world itself is an absolute treat for hardcore fans of the Zelda franchise. The world that the developers have expertly crafted here takes various elements from prior entries in the franchise and incorporates all of them together to create something which celebrates everything that made previous incarnations of Hyrule such a joy to explore. There are references to prior Zelda titles everywhere, making it somewhat difficult to figure out where Breath of the Wild occurs on the Zelda timeline. In addition to the vast open world, Link himself is equipped with a number of new abilities and skills, from being able to glide through the air, create gusts of wind, freeze enemies and items in place, and lifting various objects to smash enemies with. There are a number of ways that Link can complete any given challenge or combat scenario that makes experimentation a key component to the core gameplay system. Link can also cook different kinds of food to create various status buffs, climb just about anything that he sees, create new armor and weapons, and even slow time during combat akin to Bayonetta. There are plenty of options here to play around with, and while Breath of the Wild is an absolutely excellent game overall and one of, if not the greatest open world game I've ever played, it's paradoxically one of the most disappointing Zelda games I've ever encountered due to this very fact. Breath of the Wild is an open world game first and foremost, therefore the elements that make Zelda Zelda are sorely lacking here. The sense of growth that both Link and the player experience in tandem over the course of the franchise is replaced with a more artificial means of player progression. Instead of discovering various dungeons which contain new items and abilities for Link to add to his ever-increasing repertoire, Breath of the Wild instead gives players just about everything that they'll ever use within the first hour or so. This makes exploring its vast environment feel shallow and listless because you know when walking into a new area that the best thing you're likely to discover is a soul orb to increase your health or stamina. All of this could have been forgiven had Breath of the Wild taken inspiration from the original Legend of Zelda on the NES by integrating fully fleshed out dungeons into the open world, allowing players to feel that sense of discovery when exploring the map, but this unfortunately never happens. Instead, very much like most open world games, Breath of the Wild fails to meaningfully incentivize player exploration because it lacks the tangible rewards that prior Zelda titles used to facilitate player curiosity. Instead of slowly increasing player freedom in unique and interesting ways over the course of the campaign with new items and abilities, the developers opted to simply allow players to explore for exploration's sake, which can be fun initially, especially in an open world as well designed and beautiful as this one, but it doesn't take away from the fact that as vast and beautiful as Breath of the Wild is, it still feels shallow when compared to the likes of titles such as Majora's Mask or A Link Between Worlds. In spite of this fact, Breath of the Wild is still one of the greatest games released in 2017. However, I have a difficult time saying that it's anywhere near being one of the best Zelda games of all time. All of the elements are definitely here to create something that's truly exceptional, so I'm hoping that with their Breath of the Wild follow-up, Nintendo can capitalize on the potential that Breath of the Wild is truly brimming with. A shocking crossover that no one asked for, which turned out to be one of the best games Ubisoft has made in years. Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle is a turn-based tactical RPG, very much akin to the XCOM and Final Fantasy Tactics games. What makes Kingdom Battle stand out amongst its contemporaries outside of the clashing of these two very disparate IPs is this fine-tuned focus on positioning and movement. The enemies in Kingdom Battle are extremely intelligent, agile, resourceful, and relentless, and almost no position on the battle maps remains safe for very long due to destructible environments, various weather hazards, and status effects that Mario and friends will inevitably be exposed to. In this way, Kingdom Battle is able to avoid many of the trappings that turn-based RPGs are susceptible to, which transform what are supposed to be wars of intelligence and wit to unsatisfying wars of attrition. The way that the developers were able to translate the core Mario gameplay of jumping, running, and smashing into this truly dynamic and rewarding system is a sight to behold. Each character that you unlock over the course of the campaign is unique and interesting, and depending on how you decide to compose your team, you can create some amazingly powerful and badass combinations. In tandem, as you unlock new characters and abilities, the developers made sure to keep battles interesting with new enemy types which take many of Mario's core tropes and manipulate them in such a way so as to make for some of the most dynamic and exciting turn-based gameplay I've ever experienced. It won't be too long until you're dealing with enemies who can teleport all over the map, enemies who can bomb you from a distance, enemies who can heal themselves, and enemies who are shielded and can only be damaged from certain angles. The core combat system here is deeply layered and fun to experiment with. Using Mario to launch enemies with his hammer only to have Luigi snipe them from a distance as they fly through the air is one of the most strangely cathartic and satisfying things you will ever see in a video game. The boss fights in Kingdom Battle are especially well designed, and one boss in particular does an incredible job of verbally berating Mario and lightly poking fun at the entire franchise as you try to shut his mouth by tossing a few explosions at his face. There are myriads of ways to tackle any one combat scenario, not simply because of the placement of enemies and environmental hazards, but because of the various abilities that any one character can bring to a situation. It is truly impressive how deep and well thought out the combat system here is, and Kingdom Battle somehow never gets stale over the course of its 20-hour campaign. Outside of the combat, Kingdom Battle features a wide assortment of maps to explore, secrets to uncover, and puzzles to complete. The game world is satiated with charm and will keep you on the lookout for treasures that are deceptively well hidden. There are also places in the environment that are impossible to explore your first time through, fueling player curiosity for subsequent playthroughs. The replay value here is high, and going back through some of the earlier combat scenarios in order to get perfect ranks is fun and addictive. The only real downside to Kingdom Battle is that there are a few characters who are conspicuously missing from the roster. While you do get to fight a Rabbid version of Donkey Kong himself never shows up as an unlockable character after the game is completed. Recently, Nintendo did announce that he'd be DLC, but considering that Rabbid DK is already in the game, it felt a little strange not being able to partner up with him after the battle was over. Also, the fact that Rayman wasn't an unlock was a huge missed opportunity, which I hope will be ameliorated somewhere down the line with DLC or in a Kingdom Battle 2. Of course, other Mario mainstays such as Rosalina, Wario, and Diddy Kong would have been great to see as well, but these are very small gripes considering how many abilities each individual character has access to. The game also tends to recycle a few puzzles and combat scenarios assiduously, and while these never become too much of an issue, I would have liked to see a bit more variation after I hit my 5th box puzzle. All in all, Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle is perhaps the greatest RPG crossover that no one asked for since Disney and Square came together to create Kingdom Hearts. It's a fun, lively, addictive, deep, and genuinely engrossing experience that is hard to put down, and I highly recommend it to anyone who loves tactical RPGs, deep game mechanics, Mario, or all of the above. It's difficult to say that Resident Evil 7 is the game that fans of the franchise have been waiting for. However, Resident Evil 7 may very well have been the game that we all needed. If you were first introduced to the franchise with Resident Evil 4 and are looking for something that builds upon that foundation, you won't find it here. However, what you will find is an ode to the classic franchise where item and resource management are paramount to survival, where enemies are imposing and difficult to take down, and where exploration and navigation are crucial to progression. As opposed to the classic franchise, which took inspiration from such films as Night of the Living Dead, Alien, and the original Terminator, Resident Evil 7 takes inspiration from horror films such as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Evil Dead, and The Grudge. Clearly, these two styles of horror film are quite different from one another, but somehow the developers of Resident Evil 7 made it work by reintegrating the primary gameplay elements that the franchise introduced back in the 90s. It's easy to write Resident Evil 7 off as little more than an Outlast clone or something of that nature, but nothing could be further from the truth. Outlast is at best a hide-and-seek simulator, and while there are moments where Resident Evil 7 pays homage to this gameplay system, it never places it at the forefront of the experience. First and foremost, this is a classic survival horror game that is simply presented from a new perspective. Your player character will initially go from being completely defenseless, very much like the original games, to destroying every enemy that they come across with an assortment of weapons, including series staples such as the flamethrower, grenade launcher, and magnum. The sense of player growth and progression here is perfectly integrated with the narrative, as Ethan finds himself becoming more and more brash as he overcomes each obstacle in his path. In addition to the reintegrated survival elements, Resident Evil 7 also brings back what is perhaps the most important aspect of the classic franchise, a large and intricately designed environment to navigate through. As opposed to being played in chapters that segment off sections of the game world, Resident Evil 7 takes place in one large environment that is very well designed with quite a number of clever puzzles strewn throughout. While the level design here is definitely more streamlined than what can be found in the classic games, besides a few one-off sections anyway, overall the game developers have done an admirable job making a truly frightening and original locale that will somehow feel familiar to longtime fans of the franchise. That's also not to mention the excellent boss battles, which punctuate the completion of each area with some very interesting and unique combat scenarios that are about as gruesome as they are exciting. Then of course are the DLC chapters, which are by far the best DLC I've had the pleasure of experiencing in a video game in years, the standouts being Not a Hero, The End of Zoe, and Ethan Must Die. Each of the DLC chapters does an excellent job of revamping the core gameplay from the main campaign to create something truly unique. While Resident Evil 7 is a laudable attempt at bringing the franchise back to its roots, it does suffer from quite a number of detrimental design choices that hindered the overall experience, the primary of which being the lack of skippable cutscenes in the main campaign. While the story here is definitely enjoyable for what it is, it can become grating on repeat playthroughs when you just want to speed through the game in order to acquire all of the unlocks. Then there's the lack of enemy variety. The fact that there are only about 3 enemy types in the game, which are all similar in design, makes Resident Evil 7 feel like a huge step back from prior titles which had some of the greatest monster designs in the industry, bar none. Lastly, while the open environment here is fun and well designed to explore, there should have been more to it, because as it stands now, Resident Evil 7 feels a lot more condensed than most games in the series. If there were just more areas to explore, a few more enemy types to do battle against, and a few more boss battles, Resident Evil 7 would have truly been a worthy successor to the survival horror throne. As it stands currently, RE7, while an excellent game in its own right, very much like Breath of the Wild, fails to reach its full potential. The developers definitely did an admirable job taking risks with this title, however, it just needed a bit more. In spite of these blemishes, Resident Evil 7 is very much deserving of your time and attention, and while it may not be the return to form that many hardcore fans have been asking for, it's definitely a step in the right direction that could lead to something truly exceptional. While technically this title has been out in Japan for a few years now, it wasn't until 2017 that it found its way to Western shores, so as far as I'm concerned, this is a game of 2017, and in spite of its age, this is without a doubt one of the greatest games of the year, and is perhaps the greatest game in the Yakuza series thus far. The Yakuza franchise has always been a methodically paced experience that will steal control away from the player quite often, especially during the early chapters. However, once the game allows you to let loose and explore its beautifully realized world, you will find that it's a difficult game to pull yourself away from. With an excellently written and grounded story that will keep you guessing through various plot twists and heartbreaking scenarios, it can be difficult to believe how adept the developers are at making you feel for even the most unscrupulous of characters. What's even more impressive is how the developers were able to make such a grounded and brutal story coalesce with such over-the-top and ridiculous gameplay elements. The unbelievable feats produced by the gameplay system here works at punctuating each of the heart-wrenching plot points in the most cathartic and visceral way possible. The combat system in Yakuza 0, while not the deepest, allows players to switch styles in the heat of battle, very much akin to Devil May Cry 4. However, unlike DMC4, style switching cannot be activated mid-combo, which limits the system substantially when compared directly to titles that solely focus on combat. However, Yakuza plays far more like an old school beat 'em up infused with RPG elements, very much akin to titles such as River City Ransom or Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, so what it lacks in sheer combat depth, it more than makes up for in style and execution. Where the combat system does excel, however, is in the implementation of heat moves. Heat moves are cinematic finishers that can produce some of the most badass, over-the-top, and amazing moments in the entire game. Many of them are situational, and some of them are specifically tied to boss battles, so pulling off these attacks can be quite rewarding, especially during particularly hectic boss encounters. On top of an already rich and exciting combat system are myriads of mini-games, which are in essence games within games, ranging from karaoke, pool, dancing contests, managing hostess clubs, old Sega arcade games, and even an underground female wrestling ring which plays like a sexy game of rock paper scissors. Yakuza 0 would be a far lesser game had the developers decided to ground the entirety of the experience in realism, because it's this clashing of ideals that truly allows for players to feel the full weight of the choices made by the lead characters. Then there are the myriads of side quests and activities which are a stark contrast from the main campaign story of honor, betrayal, and redemption. While there are a few darker side quests here and there, the majority of them are laugh out loud funny and lead to some of the most ridiculously hilarious scenarios that I've ever seen in a video game. These side quests work at making Yakuza's world feel even more authentic than it would have had the developers gone down the route of realism. Very much akin to real life, there is tragedy and heartbreak, however, there is just as much levity and hilarity to be found even in the darkest of times. What I love most about Yakuza 0 is how unapologetically it's been constructed. The developers went all out when creating this game and don't shy away from topics that have become far too taboo in this day and age, including human trafficking, rape, murder, honor, and the virtues of masculinity. While I absolutely adore Yakuza 0 to pieces, it's definitely not a perfect game by any means and is without a doubt not a game for everyone. If you don't enjoy slower paced experiences that contain myriads of cutscenes that can oftentimes interrupt gameplay, you will likely be frustrated by this title. Then there is the upgrade system, which eventually becomes a matter of grinding out minigames in order to accumulate enough money to be able to acquire the upper tier moves. There are a few exploits here and there that can be used if you don't want to grind, but it's unfortunate that the grinding is such a huge component of the gameplay experience, especially during the latter half of the title. Notwithstanding, Yakuza 0 is an excellent game that will keep you enthralled with its story, laughing with its side quests, addicted with its minigames, and bloodthirsty with its combat system. It's a truly original title even when compared to its predecessors, and I cannot wait to see how the developers improved upon the formula with the upcoming Yakuza 6. There have been plenty of Sonic games that have ranged in quality over the years, however, there is yet to be a game that has truly felt like a natural extension of all of the concepts introduced in what is perhaps the greatest entry in the franchise and one of the greatest 2D platformers ever made, Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Beyond the original Sonic Advance, the series has slowly shied away from methodically constructed level design focused on momentum-based platforming, in order to focus on far more open level design in order to place emphasis on the sheer speed that Sonic and friends could achieve. While titles such as Sonic Unleashed, Colors, and Generations have had their fair share of excellent ideas and incredibly addictive game mechanics, it has been decades since a Sonic game outside of fan hacks have been able to truly take advantage of what it was that made the original title so revered. That is until Sonic Mania. Sonic Mania is easily the greatest Sonic game released since Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and in many ways feels like a long-lost sequel to the seminal title that Sega somehow failed to release during the transition between the 4th and 5th console generations. Mania is constructed as though it were a best-of Sonic title, taking some of the most beloved and cherished of Sonic's elements and infusing them together to create something incredibly familiar without feeling like a cheap cash-in meant to take advantage of nostalgia. Quite the contrary, actually. Sonic Mania feels like a true passion project created by developers who love and understand this franchise better than even Sonic Team themselves do. One of the greatest things about Mania is its level design, which will be particularly impressive for longtime fans of the franchise because while the vast majority of the stages in the game reuse assets from Sonic's past, the level design does an excellent job of subverting player expectations by giving you exactly what you remembered from the past before completely throwing you for a loop with new areas, level transitions, enemies, and bosses. The amount of imagination and creativity poured into each and every one of Mania's stages is a sight to behold, and the sheer breadth of the level design itself gives even the original Genesis games a run for their money. After having completed the game at least 18 times at this point, I'm still discovering new paths, secrets, and references with each playthrough. Then there are the special stages, which are perhaps the best in the series' history, combining elements from Blue Sphere from Sonic 3 and Knuckles, the UFO special stages from Sonic CD, and the character models from Sonic R. The special stages are fun, fast-paced, and rewarding without feeling overly difficult or frustrating. The designers were able to achieve that perfect balance between fun, accessibility, and skill, and considering that there are plenty of special rings satiating each and every level, you won't feel too frustrated when failing some of the more challenging stages a few times. Last but not least is the soundtrack, which consists of a considerable number of classic tunes. However, the standouts here are the brand new level themes created specifically for Mania that take the best elements of Sonic CD's American and Japanese soundtracks and fuses them together so beautifully that you'll have a difficult time getting them out of your head. Even though Mania is easily one of the greatest games in the franchise, it does falter in a few places where its predecessors excelled. The first of which being the boss battles. Many of the boss battles in Mania are imaginative and interesting, however some of them rely far too heavily on strange gimmicks which make the battles themselves feel somewhat unintuitive and random. There are a few battles here that simply force players to wait around until the boss decides to expose themselves to damage, which is something that many of the later 2D games have been rightfully criticized for. Then of course are the reused levels and areas. While the levels themselves mostly consist of brand new designs that are excellent and surprising, that doesn't take away from the fact that they're still being reused, and considering how beautiful and fun each of the brand new levels are, it seems like a huge missed opportunity for the developers not to have been able to inject more original content into the game. Then of course are the glitches, which range from various sound issues including music not playing in stages or sound effects being completely absent, to game-breaking glitches that won't allow you to even complete levels because the camera gets stuck and refuses to move. Many of the glitches seem to have been ironed out by this point in time, but there's no denying that some of these issues can be infuriating to come across, especially when going for one particular trophy which requires that you go through the game without saving. In spite of a few blemishes here and there, Sonic Mania is a love letter to the fans of the Sonic franchise, and while it may not be as great as Sonic 3 and Knuckles for various reasons, it's definitely a worthy successor and excellently demonstrates why Sonic the Hedgehog has been such a long-standing and influential franchise for decades. An unapologetic subversion of modern video game design that quite literally harkens back to not only the golden age of gaming, but also the golden age of animation, where each frame was painstakingly hand-drawn and full of character and soul. Cuphead is a title that will captivate you with its truly novel and unique art style while pushing your gaming skills to their absolute breaking point. The developers of Cuphead could have easily sold the game on its aesthetics alone. Even if Cuphead were a mediocre game in its own right, it would still be remembered fondly for its absolutely gorgeous and imaginative art design that is second to none. However, Studio MDHR, not merely content with giving us something beautiful to look at, also gave us one of the most finely tuned, exciting, and challenging side-scrolling shooters ever made that easily stands toe-to-toe with the all-time greats such as Contra, Alien Soldier, and Gunstar Heroes. There isn't a single boss in Cuphead that won't surprise you, and while some of the bosses may not be as memorable as others, every boss encounter works very much like piecing together an aggressive and unrelenting puzzle that refuses to allow you to gain an understanding of its rules before it pummels you to death. The trial and error nature of Cuphead will definitely be a sore spot for some players, however I cannot understate how satisfying it is to go from being completely baffled by bosses who seem impossible to defeat, only to be no damaging them 20 minutes later as if you were an experienced speedrunner. The trial and error nature of Cuphead's boss battles are very reminiscent to arcade games of the 80s and 90s that would hook you with beautiful graphics and interesting game mechanics only to destroy any sense of pride that you had in your gaming prowess a few moments later. The game does an excellent job of incentivizing player development by not only rewarding perseverance, but also by relaying to players how much they've improved after each death sustained. After being defeated by a boss, on the continue screen the game shows how far into the boss battle you are able to reach, and it also shows when the boss phase will change, which in turn makes it very difficult to put Cuphead down after starting a boss battle. There are also myriads of ways to defeat any one boss, as both Cuphead and his partner Mugman will gain access to various abilities over the course of the experience, including invincible dashes, charge shots, spread shots, health upgrades, and various super attacks which can help substantially in changing the tide of battle. Then there's the excellently constructed soundtrack filled to the brim with heart-pumping jazz tunes that will likely have you humming along as you dash, parry, and blast your way to victory. While Cuphead is an amazingly well-designed and beautifully realized title, it does have its fair share of design quirks and glitches. Even so, the glitches here aren't too substantial and only make up for a fraction of a percentage of your overall playtime. However, when they do arise, it does cheapen the experience substantially, because when a game is designed to be solely focused on skill and proficiency, any kind of random factor that may arise can turn a challenging boss into a frustrating one very quickly. In spite of a few very minor design quirks, Cuphead is an amazing game all around. With beautiful graphics, challenging, addictive, and rewarding gameplay, some of the greatest and most harrowing boss battles ever conceived, and a co-op experience that is second to none, Cuphead has become one of my favorite new IPs in years, and is easily worth the price of admission. It's the perfect distillation of what makes video games great for me. It pushes you to better yourself, it rewards you for skilled play, and it's just so well constructed and novel that I couldn't help but go back to it multiple times since its release. In a year pervaded in excellence, Cuphead somehow stands above the rest by daring to build upon classical principles and reworking them to create something wholly original and fresh. If you love challenging video games that reward skill, perseverance, and have yet to play Cuphead, you are doing yourself a huge disservice. I urge each and every one of you to give the game a chance, and if you can find a co-op partner to play with, that will be the ideal situation to be in, because it's so much fun to play Cuphead with another person and sharing your joy, frustration, and excitement. Cuphead is truly worthy of your time and attention, and is without a doubt one of the greatest games of the year. I don't think I'll ever be able to understand how time after time Nintendo is able to reinvent, redefine, and re-establish the Mario franchise as the pinnacle of excellence within the industry. The core Mario franchise is perhaps the most consistently amazing series of video games that has ever been produced by this industry. Spanning over 30 years, it's hard to argue with the pedigree that this paradigm-shifting franchise has established, and with each new entry, Nintendo has been able to inject fresh and imaginative and genuinely novel ideas into a series that's already known for being fresh, imaginative, and novel. From Mario 64's revolutionary control scheme to Mario Sunshine's excellent platforming mechanics to Mario Galaxy's focus on gravity manipulation, it's tough to see where Nintendo could have gone after already creating what are perhaps the greatest 3D platformers ever made. However, this is where Mario Odyssey comes in. Odyssey doesn't merely take the best elements from prior entries in the series and refine them to near perfection, it also makes sure to inject myriads of brand new, inventive, and genuinely surprising ideas into the mix. Using Mario 64's open-ended mission design as a basis for the entire game, Mario Odyssey feels very much like a direct extension of Mario 64. However, instead of forcing players to collect stars from each stage separately, Odyssey instead opts to fill each game world to the brim with power moons that can be collected in any order, making each playthrough a dynamic and individualized experience. The worlds in Super Mario Odyssey are structured as gigantic playgrounds that can be scaled in unique and impressive ways. While Mario Odyssey's primary inspiration for its overall design philosophy is clearly Mario 64, the game that refined Mario's movement to near perfection was Mario Sunshine. Mario Sunshine gave players access to the largest set of core platforming abilities that the series had ever seen. As much as I adore the Mario Galaxy games, in terms of core game mechanics, they are clearly lacking when compared directly to Super Mario Sunshine, which allowed for some truly creative and impressive platforming to be achieved. Odyssey takes the precedent set by Sunshine and gives Mario what is perhaps the widest assortment of core platforming abilities that the series has ever provided. There are so many abilities here that the game actually has an entire menu dedicated specifically to illustrate to players exactly how many ways Mario can traverse his surroundings. In addition to the impressive combinations of movement options, is Mario's new ability to possess enemies, allowing for even more movement options for players to take advantage of when exploring levels. There are so many different different ways for Mario to achieve any one objective, and considering that there are over 40 different enemies and objects that Mario can possess, it's safe to say that Odyssey isn't at all lacking in terms of variety. Each and every game world is excellently designed and is genuinely fun to explore. Each possession feels unique and captivating, and the core game mechanics on display here are far and away the greatest I've ever experienced in a platforming title, bar none. The only things that I can really complain about in regards to Odyssey is that Nintendo may have gone a little too overboard with the number of moons that must be acquired in order to 100% the game. While the vast majority of the moons that you will stumble across are fun and interesting to acquire, there are at least 30 moons that seem to be throwaways placed on the maps in not so obvious places for the sake of artificially extending the game length. One other aspect of Odyssey that some players may take umbrage with is its focus on open level design as opposed to the more structured platforming challenges found in the likes of Mario 64 or the Mario Galaxy games. While there are certain areas in Odyssey that pay homage to these kinds of challenges, the game overall is designed as a more open experience, which may or may not be ideal depending on who you ask. However, as it stands, Super Mario Odyssey is an absolute masterpiece of game design that is brimming with imagination, style, and fun. This is the kind of game that should not be missed by anyone who loves deep game mechanics, excellent challenges, beautiful art design, and amazing music. I don't know where Nintendo can go after Odyssey, but considering that they've been doing this for 30 years, I can't wait to see what kind of adventure Mario takes us on next time around. As usual, the iconic plumber raises the bar that he once created, only to vault over it with ease, and once again epitomizes everything that makes video games the greatest medium ever conceived. Exciting, layered, imaginative, beautiful, and absolutely fun from top to bottom, Super Mario Odyssey is easily one of the greatest games ever made and is without a doubt my favorite game of 2017. So there you have it, we have finally reached the conclusion of my top 10 games of 2017. If you made it this far, I hope that you enjoyed the time that you spent with me, as well as the interesting choices that I made for this video. I'm sure that many of you were surprised by what was included on this list, as well as the games that were conspicuously absent from here. There were a number of games released in 2017 that I simply did not get to finish or did not get to play before constructing this video, so those are the games that you should be seeing on screen right now, listed as honorable mentions. Then there are the games that I thought were well made but didn't do enough to captivate me. Titles such as Nier Automata, Neo, Splatoon 2, and The Evil Within 2 were all excellent games in their own right, however, they also failed to truly deliver as overall experiences in my view. Nier Automata was especially disappointing for me because the layered combat mechanics are never fully taken advantage of by the developers, and the enemies are some of the most boring and uninteresting adversaries I've ever seen in a video game. I'll likely go into more detail about these games at a later date or in one of my live streams, but for now I will say that they are great games that should definitely be checked out by anyone who's interested, but are hindered by design decisions that I had a difficult time overlooking. I'm sure that many of you have some genuinely interesting ideas about which games should be placed into a 2017 Game of the Year list, so be sure to share them in the comment section below. It'll be fun to compare and contrast our list and perhaps discover a few hidden gems along the way. Before I bid you farewell, I would like to thank each and every one of you for the support you've shown me. Since my last video was uploaded, I reached 5,000 subscribers on YouTube, and I'm genuinely happy about this. I'm not so much interested in quantity as I am quality, and I can say that the vast majority of you that I've been able to interact with over the years are great people who love and understand video games even better than I do. I constructed this video specifically for you guys since you take my opinions so seriously, and I wanted to produce something that was worthy of your time and attention. In that regard, I hope that I succeeded and you all enjoyed this video for what it is. And of course, I'd like to wish you all an amazing new year, and would also like to thank you for making me a part of your lives, and I wish you all the best of luck in yours. Chase your dreams, better yourselves, persevere, grow, and make the world a better place than it was before you entered it. With that said, my friends, once again, my name is Atrophy of Soul. Thank you very kindly for watching and listening, and be sure to have yourselves a fine day.